There's a version of debt in Australia that feels completely normal because everyone around you has it. Your mate just financed the new ute, your neighbour refinanced their mortgage, your colleague is still paying off their HECS, and nobody talks about any of it openly because debt in this country has become so normalised that carrying it feels like just part of being an adult. But normal and okay are two completely different things. Today, we're going to walk through every debt level in Australia, from $5,000 all the way past $1 million, and show you exactly what life looks like at each one. Because the type of debt you carry, the amount you carry, and what you do about it will shape your financial life more than almost any other single factor. Let's start where most people start, $5,000 in credit card debt. I want to be careful here because $5,000 doesn't sound like much, and that's exactly why it's dangerous. The average interest rate on an Australian credit card right now sits somewhere between 17 and 22% per year, which means if you're carrying $5,000 and you're only making minimum repayments, you are paying somewhere between $70 and $90 every single month just in interest before you've paid back a single cent of what you actually owe. Life at $5,000 in credit card debt is the she'll be right zone. And then 6 months later, the balance hasn't moved because life kept happening, minimum payments kept getting made, and the bank kept collecting interest quietly in the background, like clockwork. The fix at this level is straightforward, but it requires actually doing it. Stop using the card. Treat the balance like a bill that needs to be gone in 90 days, not eventually. Because every month you carry it, you are paying rent to a bank for money you already spent on things you've probably already forgotten about.
Now, let's step up to $20,000. $20,000 in personal debt is where the weight starts to become real. This might be a personal loan, a car loan, a credit card that got away from you, or some combination of all three. At this level, your minimum repayments are probably somewhere between $400 and $600 a month, and that chunk of your income is completely gone every fortnight before you've had a chance to do anything useful with it. The psychological effect of $20,000 in debt is significant because it's big enough to feel stuck, but not dramatic enough to force a crisis. And that middle ground is where people spend years, sometimes decades, making minimum payments, feeling vaguely stressed about money, and never quite getting a hit. The dangerous thing about this level, it absolutely destroys your borrowing power. If you're planning to buy property in Australia, your bank will assess every dollar of existing debt against your borrowing capacity. $20,000 in personal loans can reduce your maximum mortgage by $60,000 to $80,000, depending on your income. That's not a small haircut. That's potentially the difference between buying in the suburb you want and buying 40 minutes further out. $50,000 in debt, and the conversation changes completely. At $50,000, we need to split this into two very different conversations, because $50,000 in HECS debt and $50,000 in consumer debt are not the same thing, and treating them the same is one of the most common financial mistakes Australians make. HECS debt in Australia is genuinely different from almost every other debt in the world. There's no interest in the traditional sense. It's indexed to inflation. It only gets repaid when you earn above the threshold, and it doesn't show up on your credit file the way other debts do. So if your $50,000 is HECS only, the psychological burden is real, but the financial urgency is actually lower than most people think.
Aggressively paying down HECS before building an emergency fund or investing is often the wrong order of operations. But $50,000 in consumer debt, that's a completely different story. $50,000 in credit cards, personal loans, and buy now, pay later at average Australian interest rates is costing you somewhere between $8,000 and $12,000 a year just in interest. That is money being transferred from your future to a lender's profit margin every single year. And at that rate, you are not building wealth. You are running on a treadmill that is actively moving backwards. $100,000 in debt. At $100,000, most Australians are sitting in one of two places. The first is a mortgage in its early stages, which we'll talk about in a moment. The second is a genuinely serious consumer debt situation that requires a real plan, not a vague intention,
$100,000 in non-mortgage debt at average rates is costing you somewhere between $15,000 and $20,000 a year in interest alone. That's a part-time job's worth of income going entirely to servicing debt every single year. And the life that comes with it is tight in a way that's hard to describe from the outside. Every financial decision gets filtered through the lens of the debt. It affects your sleep. It affects your relationships. It affects your ability to think clearly about your future because the present feels so heavy. The people who climb out of $100,000 in consumer debt are not the ones who found a magic solution. They're the ones who got ruthlessly honest about their situation, stopped adding to the debt, made a specific repayment plan, and treated getting out of it like a second job, because that's essentially what it is.
Now, let's talk about the debt that most Australians consider completely normal, the mortgage. The average Australian mortgage right now sits at around $600,000 nationally, but in Sydney, the median's closer to $750,000, and in Melbourne, it's pushing $650,000. And if you bought in the last 2 or 3 years, you're also carrying that debt at interest rates significantly higher than the record lows that existed when a lot of people made their purchase decision. Life at a $600,000 mortgage on a standard principal and interest loan at current rates means your repayments are sitting somewhere around $3,500 to $4,000 a month. That's roughly $42,000 to $48,000 a year going to your mortgage before you've paid a single other bill. And here's the reality that the property spruikers don't love to talk about. In the first 5 years of a $600,000 mortgage, the overwhelming majority of every repayment you make goes to interest, not principal. You are making enormous payments and barely denting the actual debt. And that's not a flaw in your plan. That's just how amortization works. And most people don't understand it until they're several years in. They check their balance and they realise how little progress they've actually made. Life with a standard Australian mortgage is manageable if your income is strong and stable. It is genuinely brutal if anything changes. Job loss, relationship breakdown, health issues. Because the repayments don't pause. The bank doesn't care. And the buffer most Australian families have between their mortgage repayment and genuine financial distress is smaller than they'd like to admit. And then there's the investment property debt level, $1 million and above. This is the level where debt stops being a burden in most people's minds and starts being reframed as leverage.
And to be fair, that reframing is sometimes correct. $1 million in investment property debt secured against an asset that generates rental income and appreciates over time is a fundamentally different thing from $1 million in credit card debt. But here's what the property investment community often glosses over. Leverage works in both directions. When property values rise, debt amplifies your gains. But when values fall, or when interest rates rise sharply, or when rental income dries up, that same debt amplifies your losses. And $1 million in investment property debt at current interest rates is generating somewhere between $50,000 and $60,000 a year in interest repayments alone, which means your property needs to be performing very well just to stay neutral. Life at this debt level is genuinely complex. Your tax situation requires professional management. Your cash flow needs constant attention. And your entire financial position is heavily concentrated in one asset class, in one country, in a market that has had an extraordinary run, but has never been tested quite like it's been tested right now.
So here's the truth about all of it. Debt is not inherently bad, and debt is not inherently good. Debt is a tool, and like any tool, it can build something extraordinary, or it can cause serious damage, depending entirely on how you use it. The Australians who use debt well are the ones who borrow for assets that generate income or appreciate in value. They keep consumer debt at zero or eliminate it as fast as humanly possible. They understand the difference between their HECS balance and their credit card balance, and they treat those two things completely differently. And they always have a buffer. Because the thing about debt is that it doesn't care what happens in your life. The repayments are due, regardless. Wherever you sit on this scale right now, the single most important thing you can do is get honest about the number. Write down every debt you have, the balance, the interest rate, and the minimum repayment.
Look at the total, because you can't make a good decision about something you're not willing to look at clearly. If this gave you a clearer picture of where you stand, subscribe to Fair Income Finance and turn on notifications, because next we're going to keep building. And I'll see you in the next one.